got a really robust panel today. Welcome. This is a second meeting or a second opportunity in our webinar series this month as we are in January, which is Human Trafficking Prevention Month. So we had NCMEC at the beginning of the month, and we are following up today with an expert panel. This child sex trafficking team at the Office of the Governor will be providing a panel today where we're talking about the trauma of trafficking youth with some expert leaders here. So thank you so much for joining us. My name is Kelly Kravitz, and I'm the director of the Highly Mobile and At-Risk Student Programs Division at the Texas Education Agency, and have the honor of leading our child abuse and mandatory reporting training and work, as well as new work that we're doing on human trafficking and collaborating with the Governor's Office, Region 14, Region 12, and so many other wonderful stakeholders. So we are just thrilled that you are with us today. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is really brought to you as a part of a larger work group that we have put together to support state rollout and implementation of human trafficking prevention and awareness in Texas schools. So I briefly mentioned a few of the agencies that are a part of this, but it really is an effort, a statewide effort. The Texas School Safety Center is a part of this, DFPS is a part of this, the Governor's Office Child Sex Trafficking Team, Region 12, Region 14, the Children's Advocacy Centers of Texas, as well as other program areas at TEA as well. And it's really in the spirit of wanting to increase awareness about human trafficking and to equip you and empower you with knowledge and information beyond the mandatory training requirements that exist, so that you are more informed and can advocate within your school community and have your eyes equipped to see what you need to be seeing concerning this crime. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So just as Rod had mentioned, please do drop your name in the chat. So whether you're from an ESC or a school district, and also please mute your mics. And with that, I'm going to turn it over. So Todd Ladiolis is a leader at the Governor's Office that we work with on this work. And again, with Human Trafficking Prevention Month, we wanted to do something special and wanted to do something unique. And so this is a panel presentation that we have today. Todd will go ahead and introduce the panel, but we're going to specifically be talking about trauma of sexually exploited youth and have some expert leaders today. So with that, Todd, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kelly. I appreciate it. And it's so encouraging for me to see so many people that are logged into this webinar today, taking time out of your Friday during a busy time of the year, I know for a lot of people, to be a part of this conversation. And I wanted to preface with a quick, just to clarify, I know some of the early promotion on here showed a survivor panel, which is not what this ended up being, but I want to assure you that all of the conversation here is certainly survivor informed, a lot of work being done with survivors around our state. And we really felt like it would be impactful to focus the conversation today on trauma. A lot of us have been to presentations about adverse childhood experiences and childhood trauma, but really what does that look like for these youth in particular, for youth trafficking? And what is that, how does that complex trauma show itself in our classrooms and in our communities? And I am so honored to be joined today by two really amazing panelists. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Child Sex Trafficking Team in the Governor's Office, we were actually created by the legislature in 2015 in order to see that there's a comprehensive response to child sex trafficking in our state. So our charge is quite comprehensive. A lot of our work is focused on identifying victims, recovering them to safety, and providing them long-term healing. We also do work around prevention and bringing justice for survivors. But this work of responding to the trauma of youth is some of the most difficult stuff that we do, and it's not something that we could do on our own. It takes a lot of partnerships and collaborations. And to be perfectly transparent with you, the work being done by these two ladies is kind of the secret sauce, I think, that makes Texas far ahead of a lot of other states. And so I'm going to let them introduce themselves. I'm going to start with Allie Madison. She's with Texas Christian University. Allie, do you mind just telling folks who you are, what your organization does, and sort of what your role is around this issue?
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. Allie Madison here. I work with the Care and Purpose Institute of Child Development, who are the creators of a trauma-informed care model or intervention called trust-based relational intervention, or TBRI. Perhaps some of you folks out there have heard of it at least before, maybe not, but I hope to share a little bit about what that is and how it has worked with this population. So my background prior to actually coming on and working with the Institute was serving survivors of trafficking at a residential facility that utilized TBRI to respond and to kind of journey alongside survivors in that healing path. So hopefully I can share some of those experiences with you today. I'm currently the project director of something called the CSAE project, which helps organizations across the state of Texas implement trauma-informed care via TBRI to better serve the kiddos that we know kind of get lost in the cracks, right? This population in particular. So yes, so that's a little bit about me.
Thanks, Allie. And the work that they're doing in responding to trauma is really critical, not just in responding to youth that have been trafficked, which is a unique kind of trauma, but also responding to those kids that are at high risk for trafficking because of their prior trauma. And we'll talk about that a little later. Next, I want to introduce Lindsay Speed with Traffic 911. And you all will hear us use this term CSAE quite a bit. So just to clarify, as you see on the title slide, for us, CSAE means commercially sexually exploited youth. And Lindsay is with one of our Rockstar CSAE advocacy agencies. Lindsay, can you introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about your organization and what CSAE advocacy is?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lindsay Speed. I am the executive director at Traffic 911, and we are a nonprofit here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Started out as a grassroots organization 11 years ago, and here we are today. Not as much grassroots anymore, but I've been in this field and working with Traffic 911 for a little over 10 years now. And what we do is we provide 24/7 crisis response, case management, advocacy and mentoring to survivors of trafficking here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And so when law enforcement or investigative agency identifies or recovers a child sex trafficking survivor, one of our team is dispatched and we get to journey alongside them in their recovery journey. And so it's an honor. We've done a lot of things over the years. This field has just done nothing but change, year after year. I mean, about 7 years ago, we operated a residential home for a while. So I got to learn what it looked like, as Allie has, to live with survivors and see what their needs are 24/7. And we operated a lot of outreach over the years, but all of that informed us a lot of what we get to do today, which is really serve survivors in this unique space that Todd mentioned called CSAE advocacy. So yeah, it's great.
Awesome. Thank you, Lindsay. And before we dive in, I just wanted to, add a couple of housekeeping points, I guess, to what Kelly already mentioned. And that's to let you know that when we sat down to envision what this panel would look like, we decided we really wanted to focus our efforts on just having a frank discussion with you all. So we're going to go a little light on the slides, but we want to hear from you. I'm going to do my best to keep an eye on the chat. If something resonates with you throughout this discussion, or it makes you think of something that's happening in your region or in your district that you want to share with the group, please share that. This is a space to be sharing the work that we're doing with one another. If you have questions along the way, or if we fail to define something or something's not clear and you have a question, throw that in there. We'll do our best to address those as we go and certainly make some time for those questions at the end of the presentation. And the last thing I wanted to mention is, I'm sure you all are aware, but January nationally is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So we're squeezing this in the last few days, but really want to commend you again for being here and taking the time to learn about this. So wanted to start our conversation, you know, a lot of you have maybe been to a Trafficking 101 presentation before. Maybe you feel like you have a sort of baseline of trafficking or just childhood trauma in general. But just to kind of set the context for our conversation today, I wanted to share this video that was actually created in partnership with our friends at TCU and Allie's crew. So I'm hoping that this is going to work. We've got some folks on standby if there are issues with the sound or the video, but it's just about 3.5 minutes long. And this will get us set in the framework for our conversation.
Human trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation, and forced labor seem a world away. But according to the International Labor Organization, there are more slaves at this moment than at any other time in history. UNICEF tells us that of the estimated 40.3 million people subjected to modern slavery and psychological bondage, approximately 70% of those are women and girls, some as young as 6 years old, with abusers who can range from family members and acquaintances to gangs and persons unknown. How is it possible that something so insidious has become widespread? A recent report by the University of Texas at Austin states that in Texas alone, there were almost 80,000 sexually trafficked youths. What methods could possibly allow victims from all walks of life to be exploited and abused in this way, from the most vulnerable and at risk to those from privilege? The process can be one of violence, including kidnapping, or desperation where sex is traded for food, shelter, or necessities for existence. But often, it's a case of careful grooming, identifying a victim by looking for vulnerabilities. Traffickers target victims with emotional neediness, low self-esteem, and those under stress. By gathering information in an interested way, the goal is to create trust and build dependency, while isolating the abused from family and friends. Through phone calls and social media, the trafficker begins slowly, often supplying phones and other devices so that communication can be continuous and undercover. By fulfilling a need, the trafficker strives to become everything to their victim, including becoming the only person they can trust. Often, the dependency building includes gifts, drugs, or alcohol, but sometimes it's simply the fulfilling of a desperate need to be seen. Once trust is established and dependency is complete, control begins. Often there's been nothing asked of the victim until this point, when suddenly the threat of violence and sexual demands leave the victim confused, fearful, and psychologically battered. Sexual exploitation and physical abuse create chronic overstimulation of the brain, as the threat of violence leaves the abused to stay on high alert. The true horror is that even rescued survivors have years of recovery ahead, since recovery requires overriding trauma-related neural pathways that years of victimization create. Sadly, any association with the sex industry creates an unforgiving stigma that both shames and blames the victim. Too often, survivors are treated as criminals, as we overlook the process that has created these circumstances and the devastating consequences that can last a lifetime. This must stop. It will take deep understanding and multiple healing strategies in order to help survivors develop needed skills such as self-confidence, problem solving, and self-regulation. Only in this way can survivors distance themselves from their traffickers, reestablish their identity, and come to believe that they have inherent value.
Thank you all. Hopefully the sound was okay for everybody on that. I didn't see anything in the chat there, but I think that video just does an excellent job of distilling a very complicated issue as much as you can in just a few minutes, and really talking about the role that trauma plays in all of this. So I want to start getting us into a little bit of the discussion period right now, and want to start by talking about what it is that we mean by trauma and by complex trauma specifically. So I'm going to pass it over to Allie for just a moment and ask you, Allie, if you could just, add anything to the video that we just heard. Trauma is kind of a buzzword that I hear a lot about being trained on trauma. So if you could just break it down for us, what is it that we really mean by trauma and complex trauma specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. And the video alluded to this a lot, right? But I think that this definition can be super helpful. This comes from Dr. Bessel van der Kolk at the Trauma Center, a renowned expert in the field of trauma. And so I really like how succinct this is, because it encompasses kind of several things that you may have seen in the video. So I want to highlight a couple of things. Sometimes when we think about trauma, we may think of a single event like a traumatic car wreck, or maybe a natural disaster like a tornado. But complex trauma really directs our attention to layers of trauma that include events like I mentioned, but are sometimes that's just the tip of the iceberg, if you will. And that's not to minimize those very traumatic events, but just recognizing that they're in a different context, right? So I want to highlight a few things from this definition that I think is really important to kind of set some groundwork about what we're talking about when we notice or when we talk about complex trauma. So these words, multiple, chronic, right? Prolonged, which is, right, these things are over a period of time and are repetitive in nature. A lot of times, complex trauma happens at a young age, especially when we're talking about children and youth who are being trafficked. There's been some experiences that have been developmentally adverse even prior to the trafficking piece, right? So sexual abuse, perhaps physical abuse, some of those things that impact how your brain and body develops, which I know we'll talk a little bit more about. But I think one of the key things to talk about here is that word interpersonal. So a lot of complex trauma is rooted in the fact that it's relational trauma. It's happened with perhaps a caregiver that you're supposed to trust or is supposed to protect you, and ends up being that person that harms you. And because of that really kind of changes the game for that pathway to healing. It gets really complicated. It's not as simple a healing journey, if you will. There's just all of these layers that we kind of have to work through. So I think that that's probably a good place to start our understanding.
Yeah, I love that focus on the relational trauma aspect of this, because I think, depending on, what your profession is or where you come from, you might hear trauma and think of a trauma center, or think of, the trauma that you experienced that's really real. When my childhood home was flooded by a hurricane, that was a traumatic experience, or a car accident, or other very serious traumas. But kind of the unique nature of childhood sexual abuse and trafficking, especially that relational aspect. And I know we'll get into that. And I know Lindsay especially is very passionate about that relational healing as well. I want to continue this conversation just really thinking about, what types of trauma are we talking about? What does this look like for these youth? And what might this look like in the life of a survivor? And Lindsay, you mentioned your work as a CSA advocacy program. Often your agency is the one that's called in a time of crisis. If a child is recovered by law enforcement or whatever the situation might be. And I'm wondering if you could just maybe give us an example or walk us through the way that your organization encounters a survivor, and maybe what that trauma history might look like for that young person.
Yeah, no, that's good. I thought I did think it would be helpful to kind of give you a story to grasp onto as we talked about this. And I've got so many, but you can kind of, I don't know, use this picture. This isn't her, but use this picture, and I'll use a pseudonym. But I just wanted to talk to you about one of the girls I've had the pleasure of knowing over the years, and I'm going to call her Amy, but I met Amy when she was 15. At a CAC, a child advocacy center. And at the time she was in juvenile detention, and had made an outcry about some victimization, her exploitation, to her counselor in juvie. So she ended up being taken over to this child advocacy center. And that's where I met her. So rewind to a little bit of her history that we know of. Of course, it's hard to fully understand all of their history, but what we know about Amy is that she was adopted at a pretty early age. Her mom was a single mom out of Honduras and was ousted from her family when she found out she was pregnant. And so she was on the run, ended up, long story short, giving up the baby, and the baby was adopted here in the North Texas area. Amy was adopted. And so, so there's that. And what we know about her kind of in her early tween years maybe was just that there was a lot of just emotional, mental turmoil. So she started sort of cutting and acting out as far as having suicide attempts. And that led her into a mental health hospital. And she met a girl in there, and this girl was her friend was telling her all about this boyfriend that she had. And Amy was fascinated with this boyfriend and ended up, when she got out of the mental health hospital, following him on Snapchat. And so she goes back to school. She's back in school now and has met this guy. He asked her to meet her over at the park. And from what we know of, that was her first victimization that we know of sexually. And he ended up he was grooming her over the course of time and ended up trafficking her. What was interesting about her story is that during that first trafficking experience with him, she was going to school. So she was still going to school and meeting him at night and being trafficked at night. And then kind of back in school. And long story short, I might share more of her story later, but that's sort of how I thought it was interesting, just kind of her encounter with school and the fact that she was this kid. And just let me tell you, like, she's a really cool one. She loves Harry Potter. She reads all the time. She loves skateboarding and rock music. So it's a unique. She's a unique girl, really, really smart. And so probably didn't present in school like you would think about when I'm talking to you about one of the survivors of trafficking. So yeah, that just gives us an idea. And so here we are. We don't always know all this history. When we come and meet them, we're just there, and we may history from the investigative piece, we may not. And our advocates come in and it was me that day. And I just get to sit there and just say, hey, like, tell me about you. What do you need? And just kind of start to build a rapport. So.
Well, I have the full Harry Potter collection on the shelf behind me, so would be fast friends.
He would love you.
Obviously, Amy had a pretty significant trauma history prior to her ever being exploited, so I appreciate you shining light on that. But I think something that sticks out to me that you said is she may not have presented in the way that a lot of people expect trafficking victim or survivor to present. And I'm curious from either of you, what do you think most people in our communities, when they hear the term human trafficking or child sex trafficking, what do you think comes to mind, and how does that align with the reality of trafficking?
Yeah, I'll go and then I'll pass it to you, Ali. Oh man, our media has done a lot to portray a certain type of narrative around trafficking. And there's been so much sensationalism over the years that what we say a lot of times at Trafficking 911 is it makes the youth we serve actually invisible. Because if you're looking for a child that said they were locked in a dog kennel or in a basement, or someone reaching out for help, or there's imagery of chains, and things like that, that's not what you're going to see. And so if we portray images, like that about human trafficking, it's doing us all a disfavor and doing the survivors a lot of harm. Because what happens is, if let's say I'm Amy and I am in a bathroom at an airport and seeing a poster of this girl in chains and it says human trafficking, if you know something, say something, if you see something, say something. And she's like, well, that's not me. She would never relate to kind of how trafficking is portrayed a lot. And so, yeah, I don't know if that fully answered your question. I'll go off on soapbox, but yeah, I think that we kind of, a lot of people expect to see something a little bit more sensationalized, a little bit more extreme, and so you miss what it actually is.
Yeah, Melissa in the chat even said, you think of the movie Taken, you think about someone being arrested. And Allie, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Lindsay is spot on. That's definitely what I see a lot too, is that physical chain or kidnapping related, or what I see a lot is the assumption that trafficking is their only worst experience or the only bad experience that they've had. Pre-trafficking, life was normal and grand. And so once they're rescued, there should be this expectation of gratefulness from that survivor, or that things should just be right back on track and they should be able to enter school, or that everything should be rainbows and unicorns, or everything's perfect with her family. And what we know is that there is so much, a lot of times, probably I would say the most of the time, there's been so much prior to that trafficking is often just one layer, right? Again, since we're talking about complex trauma, there's been so much that has led up to even that vulnerability, if you will. So that's what I see a lot.
So I guess building off of that, when we're talking about complex trauma, and like you both just said, oftentimes these survivors have, a long history of other abuses or traumas, and just the child sexual abuse that a lot of us are familiar with from our work with CACs or in schools, we know that has a real impact on kids in the long term. And I'm just curious, is there anything unique about the trauma associated with trafficking and exploitation? I mean, are the results of being trafficked the same as the effects of trauma for other types of child sexual abuse, or is there anything that makes this different? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that I love how, kind of Allie said, the perpetual interpersonal part about this. And so let me give you an example of, for Amy, for example, and this is pretty average with what we hear and see with the survivors we serve. So let's say Amy's on one of her nights that she's having to work for this pimp, and she's being sold. And so let's say that night she had to make $1,000, right? And so what that means is there are sex buyers, or Johns, as some people know them, coming in a hotel room maybe and paying her for sex, typically, or paying him for sex with her. And so this is kind of what this looks like. But what I want to help you think about is, with a lot of the girls, let's say Amy was in this for, let's even just say 30 days of doing this every night, right? And how many different exploiters she had over the course of a week or a month's time. And so we talk about, all trauma is hard, and especially when there's sexual abuse involved. And so if we have one child sexual abuse encounter, that's enough. That's horrible. But when you think about, again, like what Allie said, with the fact that oftentimes these girls, I'll just say girls, it's boys too, have had prior victimization, a lot of times in the home before their trafficking. Then you hit their trafficking, and it's victimization after victimization after victimization, person after person after person, utilizing them for their body. And what does that do to make them fully distrust every human, And so I think that that's what's one way that this victimization is so unique in what they experience, and in turn what that does to their view, their worldview, their humanity view,
or their view of themselves, right? Their identity becomes, this is my purpose, this is what I'm made for. Especially when that has been proven true, not only by potentially their family members, but then outside of, right, the community members, these people that are exploiting them. So that can be, there's a desensitization that happens because it become like, this is just the way life works for me, right? This must be
Mm-hmm.
true because it just keeps happening, and so it gets internalized in a way, which I think is a little bit different. I also the because of that, the needs become higher, right? The needs
Mm-hmm.
of these kiddos are a lot because it just becomes so convoluted.
Mm-hmm. You both mentioned sort of how, the impact of this exploitation can change the way that these youth perceive the world around them, the way they think about themselves. You mentioned, they might not be behaving the way that you expected a survivor to behave. And so I want to transition to a slide that Allie gave to me to talk about the 5 Bs of trauma and sort of the way that trauma impacts a survivor. Can you walk us through these 5 Bs, Allie?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great segue because what I've already talked about is how trauma impacts beliefs, right? What we've all been talking about is, when you have these experiences over and over and over again that tell you a particular thing about who you are or your value, that gets, again, internalized and can impact your identity. I can't tell you how many kids I've heard, especially in kind of a familial trafficking experience where they've been trafficked by their family members, or prostitution is so normal. It's a family business is what I mean. That, parents will, like, I've heard kids say, my mom said I was a hoe and I wasn't going to be anything else but a hoe, right? That is it. That's my belief. Why would I even bother doing anything else? What is even available for me, like, when I've been told my whole life that this is who I am, or this is my role, or this is my value, my body.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just one of the 5 Bs, and really we call it the 5 Bs because it's just helpful to kind of trigger, right, some memory for how trauma impacts. But I want to talk about trauma, how it impacts the brain, right? So because of these repeated experiences, this ties into the developmentally adverse, right, part of that complex trauma definition. We know that it impacts development of the brain. So I'm going to give you a really quick brain lesson here. So if I'm holding up my hand, we have the brain stem, and this is going to be the brain, right? So brain stem, we have this part right here, which we like to call the downstairs brain, which describes our limbic system, which is where our survival part of the brain is. And then my 4 fingers represent the prefrontal cortex, right? The thinking part of the brain. What ends up happening because of trauma is I get an overworked fear center, overworked survival. So anything that I experience, I'm reading through the lens of threat, right? So this pops off real easy. We even call it flipping your lid, right? So when you see behaviors, or when you see that just came out of nowhere, well, that's what's happening. Their threat response is going off, and they get into survival mode because they've had to survive over and over and over again, which leaves very little growth for that prefrontal cortex, for that thinking part of the brain to be developed. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about developmentally adverse. And so when we understand that, that kid's in their downstairs brain, we have a different kind of response. And this impacts, this trickles down. So our brain is the one that signals, right, how our body should respond. So this impacts our nervous system. This impacts the way we interpret sensory input, down to lights or sounds, right, smells. And it impacts our biology, the way my DNA expresses itself, right? Epigenetics. That all of this ties into what we typically focus on, which is behavior, right? But there's so much going on, right? The behavior, if you imagine like an iceberg, it's the tip of the iceberg, and we have to kind of understand what's happening and what's happening underneath that tip that's really fueling behavior, if we want to be trauma informed.
So Lindsay, thinking about that and walking through the impact of trauma on those 5 Bs, are there any examples that come to mind where you could see Amy or another survivor you work with, that the way they behaved or the way they thought, any of those were clearly a result of that trauma?
So many, so many. I was like going through my Rolodex in my head of all these scenarios as Ali was talking. It's so good. I'm learning so much myself. But yeah, I mean, I think we talk about that flipped lid a lot, and these survivors they're constantly this, and so like, especially with Amy, what happened was over the course of time, she became a chronic runaway. And so she was sort of that flight response. And and anytime something would happen, she would run away. She would run away, come back, run away, come back, all the time. And I even think about one time she actually opened up to another advocate here one time, and they were just talking, and she was talking about running away, and she said that what did she told her she knows about her birth mom, not really sure how, but she said, well, my mom ran away when she found out she was pregnant, and she was ousted, and she was kind of sort of in survival mode, and so she feels like she connects with her mom when she runs away. And I thought that was really interesting. So that came to mind. And then I think just thinking about how there was something Ali said about how developmentally what happens to them, and their brain. And so often I'm thinking of one survivor who actually we just celebrated her the 1 year of her death. She was killed last January, and it's a really hard story. I won't go into it all, but she was 17 when she was killed. We met her when she was 14, and I have never met someone who was so developmentally delayed. Like, I was looking at a 17-year-old, but I'm telling you, I was talking to more of a 10 or 11-year-old. And so that's not uncommon. And I think that's hard, especially when people encounter survivors of trafficking or someone who's been exploited, and they'll give off a persona like they know what they're talking about. They're smart, but when you really sit down with them, it doesn't take long, I mean, to really understand, like, man, there's a lot of development happening there. I mean, our girls love teddy bears. I mean, this is to give you an example. A 17-year-old will go respond to in crisis, and we'll be down at the police station, and the first thing she wants to pull out of her backpack is the softest teddy bear you've ever seen in your life. And I would have never thought that. I would have been like, these girls don't want teddy bears? Are you kidding me? And it's just really interesting to see how they respond and what they look like in those moments.
Mm-hmm. One of the behaviors, or maybe this is not a behavior, maybe this is a brain issue, maybe it's a combination of them, but one of the things that I have found to be a real challenge in this work, and that frankly, as an attorney that works on child protection issues, drives me kind of crazy, is that a lot of times, people have seen Taken and they've seen, shackles and chains, and so then they see a real life scenario where a kid looks like they want to be in that situation, or they look somehow complicit in that situation. And we even, in looking at some research around a screening tool that we use called the See It, it's a tool that we identified from West Coast Children's Clinic to help us objectively identify exploitation. And the research on that tool, they found that 3/4 of the kids didn't even see themselves as victims to begin with. And so I'm wondering if one of you can talk a little bit about that. Why is it that youth appear complicit in their own exploitation, even though we know they can't consent to being exploited? They're protected under the law, they're being abused, but what is that about?
Yeah, sure. I'll say a couple of things that kind of come to my mind. It definitely is absolutely tied to what's happening in the brain, in the sense that trauma bonds can develop. I could spend all day talking about trauma bonds and how the pattern, again, this chronic, repetitive experiences create changes in the brain, create neural pathways that kind of get stuck, and fear, experiences of fear or trauma just kind of heighten some of those patterns or deepen some of those neural pathways that we kind of have to readjust. And Domestic violence groups will share this with you too. It takes 7 times to leave for it to really stick is the average, right? That is quoted for leaving even just domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And so the same is similar with trafficking survivors, is it takes a lot of there's relapse that tends to be part of that journey, if you will. That might be a helpful frame or reframe for some folks. And a lot of it is, again, not only that trauma bond with attachment, but there's other, when you layer drugs on top of it, like how much, if this person has supplied me drugs or food or those types of things, that all makes it really, really tricky as well. It becomes, again, very, very complex. And so that's one way it can feel like, why does she keep going back even though she's beaten so badly that she gets put in a hospital? You would think that someone would learn. And that's what I want to share about, like, the brain piece. It's not an I won't, it's an I can't. I don't have the skills yet to navigate myself to, like, we put a lot of emphasis on choice, and it's not always as black and white as having a choice about that. I don't know if Lindsay, you probably
yeah, no, that's such a perfect way to say it. I think it comes down to the public perception is choice. And so this is why it looks like, yeah, but they all want to do this. And if I've heard that once, I've heard it 1,000 times from law enforcement, from counselors, from parents, and it's tough because it's not what meets the eye. And so I think that's what's hard to see is you see, I mean, I've talked to girls who say, well, this is what I want to do. And, but you got to dig deeper than that. And you got to see, I mean, as I've gotten to know them, I'll find out, man, their home life was so horrible that they actually feel like this is better. Even though to us, it's like, what? That's crazy. But it's like, I don't know what that was like living in your home. And to them, there's this element of choice because you've got maybe a trafficker in your ear saying, hey, good job, baby. You earned that $100. Good job. You're helping our family. And they're getting validation. Very screwed up, right? Very twisted, but there's validation there. And so I kind of, the way we like to talk about shared humanity a lot and sure to try to be like, let me put myself in here, or else what have I experienced that I can connect with? And this might seem shallow, but in recovery, in addiction, in anything that we're trying to do, let's say we're all trying to lose weight. Let's say I'm trying to lose weight. Let's talk about how many diets we have all been on, how many good intentions we had, and we still couldn't, quite get it. And so times 4 million, and you've got a kid in a situation that, there is bonds. There's this new family because she's got a couple sister friends who are with them, and they're bonded. They all had a hard life, and now they're in this together and they're surviving together. And then you've got these people saying, no, come back home, or we've got treatment for you. And so this is that relapse Allie is talking about, where you go back and forth and they try just like we try on a diet. And it's like, nope, maybe not time yet. And so there's sort of this trickle back and forth. And that's why trust being built over time is so important, because that's what traffickers are doing. They're building trust in that unit over time. And so I think that's why sometimes it's not what meets the eye. It's a lot harder to understand why it looks like they're choosing this.
And who wants to be seen as a victim, right? Who wants to be seen as out of control? Or it is it's a part of its defense mechanism, right? Like, no, I chose this. This is, because I just need to have power or control over something in my life because everything else feels so chaotic.
Yeah, it's good.
We're getting into like the last 15 minutes. I just want to remind people, if you have questions that you want to be typing in, that we'll have time to address them. But I want to ask one more question that will kind of shift us into the last segment of this, thinking about the way that trauma, impacts these areas. And I'm thinking especially behavior, and knowing we have a lot of educators on the line. Is there anything that comes to mind, like how might some of this manifest in a classroom or whatever, venue that you encounter youth? Like, what are some of the behaviors and things you might see from a youth that's been through this trauma?
Yeah, I've seen lots of, again, so here's what I'll say. I think a lot of our attention gets focused on those kids that are aggressive, fighting, yelling, can't like get out of the classroom or some, that kind of thing. Um, and or those that skip school, right, or who aren't even there, are seen, as the troublemaker. Um, we see those types of things, and sometimes we might miss those kids that are that don't have that fight survival mechanism. They have that freeze, right, or flight mechanism where they just completely shut down, and both are just as they can be just as painful, like what's happening physiologically with the body, because it is still a response to threat or trauma. But it's easier to see, I think, some of those more explosive behaviors that might appear, or even just like little things like disrespect, right? Which sometimes can get under people's skin even more than some of the other things. But that's what I hear a lot of issues around. When I encounter folks, just that disruption, right? I see a lot of like disruptive behaviors that are difficult, especially when you're managing a class, right? That can be, very, very challenging. Lindsay, what do you see?
Yeah. I feel like it's so hard to, I don't want to say dumb it down, but to kind of put this list out, because I think for so long in this field, people are like, well, I don't see a tattoo. I don't see this. I don't see this. So they must not be trafficked. And it's so hard because it can look so many different ways, like Ali was saying. And so I don't know. I mean, to me, it's like I would encourage you, get to know them. And and sometimes there's just something in your gut. There's something in your gut, something's not right, something is weird. Ask questions, like not like, are you being trafficked, but just like, hey, how's it going, when you're not at school, or something like that, just to get to know them, because then you're building trust, then they're letting you into their life, then you can start to put together the pieces. It's so hard to kind of recognize a behavior and all of a sudden think something. But I mean, like some of the ones Ali was saying, I mean, a lot of the girls are a little bit truant, and so there's some runaway history, or they're not, they're here one day, gone the other. They're talking about maybe older friends or even gang members. Sometimes are a part of this, where there's a group and there's some unhealthy behaviors. A lot of unhealthy behaviors are what you may deem as a high risk kid. That's the kids. So there's nothing super crazy about it. The kids in your school that you guys all know are high risk kids, those are the ones you're going to be, for the most part looking for. And of course, high risk can look a lot of different ways, like Ali said. But I think that the message I want to get across, though, is, go deeper, get to know them, and then you can kind of learn more.
Yeah, you both already have sort of gotten us to this last part of the conversation, which is, we started talking about sort of what is trauma, how does it manifest, what does it look like for these survivors, and we're starting to talk about, like, so what for us? How do we respond in a way that's trauma informed? What does it mean to be trauma responsive? And so I want to spend the last little bit of time that we have, talking about that practically. And I know we all go to trauma informed care trainings. Now we're trauma informed and we know how to respond. So maybe Ali, just kind of walk us through, what does that buzzword even mean? What does it mean to shift our understanding when we see these behaviors?
Yeah, absolutely. Trauma-informed care it sounds lovely, and it's definitely become more mainstream, which is good, but it can also feel a little abstract. So this is a great word, empowering. I'm supposed to empower my students, but what does that actually look like on a day-to-day basis? I'm supposed to build trust and safety, but what does that look like in a one-on-one interaction with a student? And so this is where interventions, I think, like TBRI, which is what I train a whole lot in, is really helpful because it equips people in those day-to-day interactions. TBRI isn't the only one out there. I think schools have several great models that kind of break it down and provide, tools around regulation skills or mindfulness, right? Like when you think of the emotional backpack curriculum or coping cat, and, there's all of these tools, and it's just how do you develop your tools so it can be truly a trauma responsive, interaction. And what that does, that shift that you see, this paradigm shift, this what's wrong with you to what happened to you, you're shifting from assuming that the behavior is a choice, right? And you're seeing that there's a need behind this behavior. And think of it like as a crying out, right? A crying out for help in some ways. And how do I meet that need through these tools that I've been given or that we've been talking about, so I can see, what that trauma stuff that is informing that behavior. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. I'd be curious, if folks on the chat want to share, if there is a program or training or resource that has helped folks in your school get those tools. Share those in the chat. We're going to have a link to a TEA resource at the end that gives a bunch of different TBRI, some of the programs Allie just mentioned and others, but would be curious what folks on the line are already utilizing in their areas. Lindsay, anything you want to add about that shift in trauma-informed care? One question I know I wanted to ask you, because we talked about this before, is there an area where where do we get this wrong? I guess, where have you seen our response to this just not be the best it could have been for these youth?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a good, it goes to being trauma-informed is trying to take your expectations, change your expectations. I don't know what the right words are, but I think one of the things we do that you cannot do is put your hopes, your expectations, your wishes, your goals onto them. You're projecting onto them, and that's not being trauma informed. And so guess what? They may not go to college. Guess what? They may not finish high school. That's the reality. And so you've got to meet them where they are right now. And let's take baby steps forward. Asking why is one of the big no-nos that we try to say. I think we mean well because we want to understand, like, why did you run away again? Why didn't you do your homework? Or whatever the situation is. They don't know why. You just heard Allie talk about the brain. If they could tell us why, we would be way over here, like they don't know why. And so that's kind of, you don't mean it, but it sort of is it feels blaming because I don't know why. And so I think that not asking why is a big one, not projecting, your own version of success on them, help meet them where they are and say, like, what would you like to see happen? Like, what do you want next year or next month or next week? Taking it just kind of from where they're at is really important.
Yeah. And something that I've talked with a lot of survivors about is just also this chronic sense of shame as well in a lot of this exploitation, the shame and, responsibility they feel from their own choices, perceived choices. And I think a lot of times, as parents and as like caring adults, sometimes our reaction, because we're protective, is, what were you thinking? What is wrong with you? Or I know we had a conversation a couple of weeks about online exploitation, like, why were you talking to that person? Why were you looking at that material? And we think it's going to be protective, but it ends up triggering some shame that often goes deeper into those dangerous behaviors. So I think that's really important. One area I don't want to miss talking about in our last few minutes, and it's come up in the chat, about being that trusted person, about having that safe, healthy relationship with the youth. And I know there's been a lot of research around trauma, both in helping people who have been abused and also preventing abuse, frankly, around, safe adults, healthy relationships. I'm curious what either of you can share about that, and maybe as a message of hope to a lot of educators that are maybe filling that role for these youth.
Yeah, I mean, I do think you guys, can be the preventative measure, because I think that sometimes people in the education system, gosh, you get to know these kids better than their parents do sometimes. And so the fact that you can see a kid over time, progress or regress, or whatever that looks like, you get the opportunity to notice it, hopefully before the victimization, or before something worse happens. And so I think that that's so amazing about the role that you all play in this, is that you can see change. It's different when I'm talking, or we're training, like, let's say medical staff that see a person one time, or other professions who it's a little bit harder, because you've got to understand someone's time, like just over time, so themselves over time, their story over time, to see it, and to notice the real behavior changes. And so the fact that you guys could step in to be that trusted person that they don't have, which is, I feel like most of the stories that we hear is that they're longing for love and belonging. Like, that's what they want, is love and belonging. And this is why these traffickers, these exploiters, these recruiters online are taking advantage. And it's so easy. There's such easy prey, because they just want somewhere to belong and someone to love them. And so the fact that you can provide that, in a safe, healthy setting is amazing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, human connection is what we're created, right? We are created to be connected with each other. And that is also what can be powerful for healing. So research tells us that it is that, like, even just one healthy, safe adult can make a huge impact. And so how you can be one, I mean, schools are fantastic because they're on the front lines. You guys, a lot of times are helping us, right? Do those identifications and reports that get a lot of those kids connected to further services. So we know that stuff is already happening. Just how do we be even more intentional about it and keep our ears open? And yeah, absolutely. It's so important for, again, those two pieces, not just the recovery piece, but the prevention piece as well. Mm-hmm. And I think that we underestimate the power of relationship building. It's not programs that change people. It is people that change people. Mm-hmm. And I just think that's so great that our brains kind of operate in that way, because that does tell us that there's hope.
Yeah, that actually was what I was going to ask. A lot of times I think we think in terms of recovering from trauma. It's like, oh, if we only had this really special safe house or ranch or shelter in our community, or we just had this special program, like we could meet their needs, they would be happy, like they'd be rainbows and butterflies, from there on out. And I know that there's a need for specialized services. We need programs that can respond to those. But if you had any other comments about what it really takes to get on that road to long-term healing, any comments you would make on that?
It takes a village. I think that's what we're finding, is that I love that. I know someone quoted that. I wrote that down. I'm like, I'm going to quote Allie. It's not programs that change people. It's people that change people. We have free people behind us, because that's what we believe, it's just that it's a community effort. Like, these are our kids, and so it takes all of us. It takes foster parents. It takes mentors. It takes all of us to affect change, not just these specialized things. And so I think that's our hope, at least at Trafficking 911, is how can we engage the community to care for and wrap their arms around these kids, not just a counselor or a teacher or a specialized program or residential treatment program, all of us.
Mm-hmm. This has been an awesome discussion. If you guys knew how many more questions I had on my list that I foolishly thought I might have time to get to, but this discussion has been so good. I want to, before we wrap up, share some resources that TEA shared with us, where you can go to their website and see a lot of those programs and practices to respond to trauma, including TBRI and other programs. And I'm going to put up this survey slide at the end so that you all can give feedback, but I just want to give one last chance if there's anything from either of you, Allie or Lindsay, that you'd like to leave these folks with. If there was one thing they could take away, maybe we just did it, it's people, not programs, free people, but any last parting words? I don't see any questions in the chat, so.
I don't think so. No, I just want to encourage you guys to see behind the behavior, see behind
Mm.
the acting out. These kids want to be seen so bad, and so I know there's so many of y'all doing incredible work, and just thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's exactly what came to my mind, Lindsay, was just see the need behind the behavior. There is a need, and so often our kids just get dismissed for being bad, and we are missing some true gems, right? These kids that are part of our community, if they're just given a chance to shine, they would shine. So I just again encourage you guys as well. Keep doing the hard work. I know it can be hard to do, especially when we're ourselves are stressed, but keep it up.
Yeah, and my last comment would be, look into those programs. There's great prevention education that's worth exploring. We definitely want to provide that education. We want to equip the educators to understand both prevention and responding to trauma, but also take comfort and hope in knowing that you've been doing the work of helping kids from hard places just by your presence and just by your safety and just by being that person. And so I hope you take some comfort in that. I know that I do. Please scan this QR code. It'll lead you to the survey to provide feedback to TEA in this webinar series. Thank you, Allie. Thank you, Lindsay, so much. This was awesome. You guys can, we'll share the resources after this. You can find our contact information if you have questions. And I know that Rod put a lot of links in the chat for you all to follow. So thanks so much. And I think with that, we'll wrap it up.
Great. Thank you everyone for joining today. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Allie. Thank you, Lindsay. That was phenomenal. And we'll have the recorded presentation available for you. Thanks so much, everybody.